Good afternoon to all of you. It's a real privilege and a pleasure to introduce Dr. Arvind Subramanian, the Chief Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance of the Union Government in India. Dr. Subramanian has a stellar, extraordinarily impressive CV. He started at St. Stephen's College and IIM Ahmedabad, which people call the Harvard of the East, but there are those who now say that Harvard is the IIM Ahmedabad of the West. And then he went on to get a DPhil from Oxford. I think he did some work with GATT at the time of the Uruguay round, the earlier incarnation of the WTO, and then spent about 20 years in the research department of the IMF, and worked for both the Peterson Institute for International Economics as well as the Center for Global Development in Washington. When I think the call from his homeland came, and he became the Chief Economic Advisor about 4 years ago. Now, the contribution that Dr. Subramanian has made over the last 4 years or so was encapsulated in a Facebook post that the Union Finance Minister of India, Ms. Arun Jaitley, penned. It's a heartfelt and extraordinarily moving and impressive testimonial to the role that Dr. Subramanian played. There were many ways in which he added considerable value from his position as the Chief Economic Advisor. In fact, when we were chatting for a few minutes before coming here, he was telling me what a unique role the Chief Economic Advisor plays in India. And there's probably no other country in the world has such a position, which sort of is placed between the policy making within the finance ministry, very centrally within the policy making framework of the finance ministry, but at the same time, the position has considerable independence for the Chief Economic Advisor to think afresh, to think new, to innovate, and he has done that excellently. There are a number of things where his contribution has been, has kind of helped to move the needle. He came up with the neutral revenue formula, which enabled the GST to be introduced into India. His economic surveys are now, I think, universally acclaimed. I think 15 million hits in 150 countries, is that right? Yeah, the latest economic survey. And he raised the analytical work associated with the Chief Economic Advisor to an extremely high level. And because of the strength of his analysis and the incisiveness of his thinking, and the great when you listen to him speak, you will know there's tremendous enthusiasm and energy to go with the intellectual firepower. And that has made him a formidable advocate for reform in India. And he has played a very important role in some of the reforms, very important reforms that have taken place in India. So it is with very, very great pleasure that I now call upon Dr. Subramanian to address us.
Honorable Governor Kumaraswamy, the Senior Deputy Governor, other Deputy Governors, friends who've shown up. It's a great pleasure to be here in Colombo, Sri Lanka, my first visit here, And after coming here, I'm 100% sure it's not going to be my last visit. I want to first of all thank the governor for his extraordinarily kind and generous words of introduction. I have to say that Sri Lankan hospitality is formidable, even otherwise. But when it's backed up with seigniorage from the central bank, it's unmatched. So thank you so much for the wonderful hospitality. The provocation for my coming here, or actually what made it happen, was the governor and I were in Washington for the spring meetings together, and we started chatting, and I think it's fair to say that we hit it off immediately, Governor, and so he was kind enough to invite me, and I'm really delighted to come here. So when I was thinking about what to speak on, and what in fact I had promised the Honorable Governor, was I thought I'd speak about economic development more broadly. But I think that as the day approached and as I started learning and reading up about Sri Lanka, I thought, I'm not going to know Sri Lanka even remotely as well as all of you here, but I thought I would, take this opportunity to also share my views on Sri Lankan economic development as well. The only excuse I can invoke for being an interloper and talking about subjects that I probably shouldn't be is that I am planning to write a bigger book on economic development, and I think Sri Lanka is going to be a feature in that book quite prominently. So with that as excuse, I'm going to kind of launch in to this. So as you see, the topic is the late Converger stall and Sri Lankan economic development. I'm going to explain a late Converger stall a little later, and why Sri Lanka has to be a little bit careful about the prospects of slowing down going forward. But before I come to that, let me just give you a sense of the presentation. I'll speak for about, say, 40 minutes or so, and then happy to take, Q&A, Governor, if that's okay. I love interacting with my audiences, and maybe in the Q&A, I can share with you a little more the experiences in India and how they travel or do not travel to your own country. So the presentation is going to be in 4 parts. What are Sri Lanka's achievements? What are the challenges? How should it think about what I call the late Converger stall? And I'm going to conclude. I have a reputation for breaking eggs in order to make omelets. I have the permission of the governor and all the deputy governors to be a little bit frank and highlight some of the key challenges of Sri Lanka as well. It's all done with the best of intentions, so please don't get me wrong. But for the sake of actually, furthering our understanding, I think it is important also to focus on some of the key challenges that Sri Lanka faces. Yeah. So let me. So as I go along, I'll try and share some of what I've learned about economic development with all of you and situate Sri Lanka in that broader context. So what are the significant achievements? So one way to think about this is what we call an economic convergence framework. I don't know how many of you can see the chart. Robert Solow had this great insight that essentially countries that start off poorer should grow faster over time, and that's the way over time poorer countries catch up with richer countries. And that is shown in this chart. It's meant to be downward sloping because on the horizontal axis you have the starting level of per capita GDP. On the vertical axis you have GDP per capita growth. So the poorer you are, the faster you must grow, and that's why you see that downward sloping line. This is over a very long period, 50, 60 years. And you can see that Sri Lanka, which is in blue there, is above that line. What that is saying is that Sri Lanka has certainly not been an underperformer. For its level of initial starting point, it did better than on average than most countries. However, it didn't do spectacularly better than other countries. So it's kind of a solid above average performance on long run growth. I guess this is the time to step aside and say that, you see, when we make all these comparisons, a lot depends upon what you're comparing with. There's a very famous saying that, the economist's wife turns to the economist and says, "Honey, do you love me?" And he says, "Relative to what?" So in a sense here, if you think that the comparison should be how other countries have done, Sri Lanka has not done too badly. Actually, it's done quite well, reasonably well. But of course, I think many of us, the benchmark we have for Sri Lanka was rolling back the tape of time to say 1950, early 50s, to say this was a country that did have a head start relative to many other countries. So the expectation was that Sri Lanka would do spectacularly and in fact would be something like a Singapore today. So against that benchmark, yes, Sri Lanka has maybe fallen a little bit short, but I think that a fairer assessment would be this long-run convergence assessment, and there it's not done too badly. Something like $11,000 per capita GDP in purchasing power parity terms is a reasonably good standard of living, almost close to China's today. So I think in that sense, think of always the economist's response to his wife when you think about how to assess Sri Lanka from a long-run point of view. So this is one perspective on long-run performance. Another perspective is given by Acemoglu and Robinson. They had a book called Why Nations Fail. And essentially, the book can be summarized in one sentence. Political evolution determines economic evolution. And that politics, the more democratic you are, the better the very long-run performance. So you have here similarly on the x-axis some index of politics, a democracy index, and on the y-axis you have a measure of per capita GDP, and essentially their hypothesis says that the line is upward sloping. The more democratic you are, the more evolved you are politically. Now, when this book came up to wide acclaim, and it is a very, very good book that all of you should read, I noticed that the deputy governors over sumptuous lunch had shown that they'd read Ruchi Sharma's book, but not as many had read Acemoglu Robinson. Please, you have to make amends for that. It's a really good book. However, the funny thing about this is that when this book came out, I wrote a rejoinder to that, essentially that this theory, which by and large fits the facts, fails spectacularly in explaining the world's two largest countries, India and China. Because if you look at that chart, India is way below the line on one side and China is way above the line on the other side. What this means is that India, for its level of political development, it actually has not done as well in terms of how rich it is. That's why it's below the line. China, on the other hand, for its level of political development, has done very well. I mean, or to put it more provocatively, China had no business to do so well, given the fact that it's still, its political evolution is way behind. So if you leave aside these two exceptions, by and large, the theory fits the facts very well. And it turns out that Sri Lanka, which I've put in that blue dot, is very close to the line. So that means that basically it's performed very typically, that for its level of political development, it's by and large attained the economic standard of living that Acemoglu and Robinson would have predicted. So whether you look at it from a pure solo convergence point, you start off rich, you will not grow as fast, but by and large you do well. Or if you take this political perspective, institutional perspective of Acemoglu and Robinson, Sri Lanka has done exactly as the theory would have predicted. And this is it's posted. Now I was looking at savings and investment rates. I think Sri Lanka is kind of middle of the pack to fit with its growth performance. And of course, on all these social and other social indicators, Sri Lanka has done very well. So in this chart, you have you have a measure of mortality, you have the poverty headcount ratio, you have fertility and standard of living. What you find is that the blue is 1960, the red is 2016, and if you see this chart carefully, Sri Lanka had a head start relative to all the South Asian countries, and over time it's kind of maintained that gap on all these other indicators as well. So again, this is to reinforce the point that yes, it had a head start, but it has kind of maintained that gap over time with at least with its South Asian neighbors, and so this is another sense in which it has performed reasonably well across all the social indicators in line with its head start. This is a slightly more complicated way of saying that actually on health and maybe even on education, Sri Lanka performs better than what countries at a similar level of development would have. Sri Lanka is well below the line on this relationship between infant mortality and per capita GDP, because essentially that the richer you are, the lower will be the infant mortality rate. But Sri Lanka does even better, which just shows that I think there is a sense in that in terms of social delivery of health and education and so on, actually Sri Lanka has done quite well and better than the average country. So I want to begin by saying to all that's happened in the last 30, 40, 50 years, I think you should all, and of course, the background to all this, of course, which I think now is the right time to mention, is that Sri Lanka has achieved all this against a background of social conflict, of severe social conflict. So in a sense, this is kind of not just good, maybe it's very good if you actually factor in this, long period of social conflict. I remember Shanta Devarajan writing a piece 10, 15 years ago. One of the puzzles of South Asia was how does Bangladesh do so well, given that on standard, corruption indicators, it doesn't do very well. And Sri Lanka, how does it do well despite the fact that it has conflict? But what this is saying is that you've done well relative to where you started off with, relative to your political inheritance, but that achievement, I think, should be seen against the background of this, severe internal strife you've had, which makes, I think, the achievements all the more remarkable. So I want to begin by saying congratulations on, really very good long-run performance. Now, no economist worth his salt, no social scientist worth his salt, no friend of a country would just come and tell you the good news. I think we have to talk about the very real challenges. And I have to say, and I mean this absolutely sincerely, I'm going to show you 4 charts now that have absolutely stunned me, which I did not expect as I was preparing for this lecture. So this is something that I think it's quite striking about Sri Lanka. I'm going to leave this chart. I mean, this tells you what inflation, current account balance, budget deficits have been in Sri Lanka for the last 40, 50 years. But striking chart number 1 is this. This shows since 1975, the IMF programs that Sri Lanka has been part of. Now you see that there is more color than white in this chart. That means that in much of Sri Lanka's history, it's been, has had to go to the IMF. So it stunned me, and this has not been true of some of the other South Asian countries, certainly not India. India has not been to the IMF so often. Even I think Bangladesh has not been as often as Sri Lanka has been. And what this shows is that there have been ongoing macroeconomic stresses in Sri Lanka for forever and forever. So this is striking fact number 1, that I told you all the things that Sri Lanka had done well, but this has happened against a background of continual macroeconomic stress. I want you to hold this thought about macroeconomic stress because I'm going to come back to what it means for the long run for Sri Lanka. Now, after 1998, when that famous picture of Kondesu, standing over Suharto, signing away the Indonesian sovereignty as part of the IMF program, East Asian countries said, never again will we go to the IMF. And IMF lending has had kind of a stigma attached to it, but evidently the stigma has not extended to Sri Lanka. And even now Sri Lanka goes to the IMF. I don't know how to interpret that, good or bad, but there it is. Sri Lanka is a kind of atypical in that respect from other Asian countries as well. So striking fact number one, ongoing macro stresses. Striking fact number two, this is really, really striking to me. First, look at the bottom chart. This is tax to GDP ratio in Sri Lanka on a continuous decline for the last 20, 25 years or 30 years. Almost all countries as they develop and as they grow, tax to GDP ratios rise. At the worst, they remain constant. And Sri Lanka, on the other hand, over time, despite growth, reasonably healthy growth as I showed you, has seen its tax to GDP ratio, plummet from 19 to about 10. And of course, the good news is in the last 2 or 3 years, I want to congratulate your current policymakers, but the long run trend is very disturbing and very striking. That's the bottom chart. The charts, what the two charts above are showing is that in 1990, Sri Lanka collected more taxes relative to its per capita GDP, but in 2016, it had, relative to its per capita GDP, it was collecting much less. So from being an overperformer on taxes, you become an underperformer on taxes, and that's reflected in the declining tax to GDP ratio. This is stunning, believe me. This is not usual. It doesn't happen in other countries, and I want to come back to this again when I conclude. So that's striking fact number two. Striking fact number three, and here we're kind of wading into slightly controversial areas, but then, what am I here for but to raise controversy, if you don't mind. I am struck by how external debt to exports, external debt service to exports, you see the left-hand side chart has, it's just, increased just very dramatically from about 130% to upwards of 250%. And the right-hand side chart shows that the share of concessional debt to total debt has plummeted from 75 to 30%. So in a sense, debt to exports have gone up very dramatically. To the extent that I think broader external sustainability, macro viability, challenges are created. And debt has gone up, but debt service has also gone up because loans are less concessional compared to the past. So this is something that I think also let's keep in mind. And I'm going to come back to this also as a very unique and distinguished, very unique feature about Sri Lanka, which I'm going to try and explain at the end. So this is striking fact number three. And this is striking fact number four. The red lines, the red lines show exports to GDP and manufacturing exports to GDP for Sri Lanka. And the black line shows the same thing for the world. I have circled that area to show that just at the time when the world was hyper-globalizing, essentially from about the early 90s to, say, 2010, 20-year period, the world was hyper-globalizing, Sri Lanka was deglobalizing. Of course, it coincided with a period of conflict and so on, but even so, as a long-term trend, Sri Lankan exports to GDP, manufacturing exports, have really, shrunk dramatically at a time when the world was going the other way. This is very striking. I don't think I've seen this in many other countries. Normally, you would think that countries would kind of follow the pattern of many other countries, but that's not been the case. And at the very end of this, I've just shown for a bunch of other countries what the manufacturing exports to GDP ratio is. And you can see Vietnam is off the charts and Bangladesh. So Sri Lanka has performed now today, the manufacturing exports to GDP is below Bangladesh and Vietnam, although slightly above Indonesia, India, and Pakistan. But then India should not be the right comparison for this because it's a much larger country, bigger internal market. You have to compare with other smaller countries. We know from the theory of trade that smaller countries trade more than larger countries. So the comparable points should be similar countries. And Sri Lanka, after having done relatively well, has kind of underperformed, has deglobalized very rapidly. So 4 striking facts. 1, ongoing macro stresses. 2, a dramatic decline in tax collections and the tax to GDP ratio. 3, rising reliance on external resources and burden of external indebtedness. And 4, deglobalizing when the world has been hyper-globalizing, as it were. So these are the 4 facts that strike me as, both short-term and medium-term challenges for Sri Lanka. And I'm going to come back to, what it means in terms of what we can do about it going forward. Now, this is an aside. The late Converger stall. What do I mean by the late Converger stall? In the last 10 years, one kind of syndrome has been highlighted by the World Bank, which is called the middle income trap. That is, as countries reach middle income status, their growth starts to slow down so that very few countries actually make the transition from middle income to, say, upper middle income and rich high income status. And the reason for the middle income trap is that when you become richer and richer and attain middle income status, you don't have the capability or the technological prowess to become a high income country. On the other hand, you lose competitiveness, so there's pressure from below. So it's kind of a scissors that you're caught in these middle income countries, which prevents the transition to the next level. What I worry about was whether a similar kind of pattern is discernible for countries just below the lower middle income countries. So this was, of course, prompted by my thinking about India and a lot of low middle income countries, and Sri Lanka is kind of part of that as well. So is it the case that going forward, this dynamic process of convergence whereby poorer countries became richer, is that going to be stalled from now on because the external environment has changed? And in fact, when we were in Washington, the governor read a piece I wrote in the Financial Times highlighting what could be these forces that slow down the prospects for lower middle income countries like India and Sri Lanka. There, the 4 factors that I identified was, look, there's a backlash against hyperglobalization. And what is happening is that, as you can see, barriers to trade are being erected in advanced country markets. Therefore, is it the case going forward for countries like India and Sri Lanka, the world market will be less conducive to export than it was for the Japans and the Chinas and the Taiwans 30, 35 years ago? So are we now in a different environment, which is going to make us much more difficult for us to converge compared to the early convergers like all the East Asian countries? So the hyperglobalization backlash is one, and it's something that for a country like India, one has to worry about much more than Sri Lanka, because as a small open economy, even if you kind of export your way, into heaven, it's not going to make a big dent in advanced country markets. Whereas if an India or a China were to export, it would provoke protectionist barriers in advanced countries. India is experiencing that on the services side in terms of visas, but it's something that could affect other countries as well. So this was the first kind of factor that could create the late converger stall. The other thing was that climate change is something very important for India. I just don't know enough about how important it is for Sri Lanka. Although I just saw a World Bank report which said that Sri Lanka has one of the kind of hotspots in terms of vulnerability to climate change. But this is something also that if climate change is serious, it's going to slow down agricultural productivity in countries like India. That's also going to make the transition from lower middle income to upper middle income status much more difficult. Then, of course, there's the Danny Roderick point that are we late convergers susceptible to this, what he called premature deindustrialization? That is that for a variety of reasons, we do less manufacturing, have been doing less manufacturing than the early convergers did. And this is a chart which just shows that, the poorer countries are peaking at much lower levels of manufacturing and much earlier in the development process. And so and to some extent this has afflicted Sri Lanka as well, that your share of manufacturing has peaked quite early on in the development process. And the final thing is the human capital challenge. Take a country like Sri Lanka, for example, right? Supposing Sri Lanka said, look, we are now $11,000 per capita GDP. We are no longer going to be as competitive doing, textiles, clothing, jewelry, footwear, and all these things. What is our next source of, dynamism and growth? If it's going to be something like services, say Sri Lanka wants to attract IT services, for example, then the human capital capability in the population should be commensurate with that aspiration of becoming an IT power. Now, here is a small aside, a criticism, that this is a colleague of mine, Justin Sandifer, has put together this thing on where developing countries stand on human capital attainment at different points in time, the 3 different points. The crux of this is that lower countries are falling behind on human capital attainment relative to the richer countries. They are further behind today than, say, the Chinas were, 30 years ago. Sri Lanka, unfortunately, is not part of this because it turns out that Sri Lanka has not been part of any of these educational cross-country, like the PISA. I'm told Sri Lanka is not a part of that. There are many, many kind of educational attainment indices, and it turns out that Sri Lanka is not part of any of them. So my request to the policymakers here is that you should try and become part of this to get a sense of where you stand. But my hunch is that probably Sri Lanka is vulnerable to the same human capital challenge that many other lower middle income countries are, in the sense that perhaps the human capital capability to keep up with the advances, especially if you think that robotics, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things are things of the future, then the only way you can take advantage of that is by having a population that has high levels of human capability. So in terms of the 4 challenges, the backlash against globalization, the premature deindustrialization, climate change, and the human capital challenge, my sense is that for Sri Lanka, 2 or 3 of them are probably not that relevant, but I do think the combination of premature deindustrialization and the human capital challenge are going to be very important for Sri Lanka going forward. So thinking about the transition, I think, is going to be very important. Now, back to Sri Lanka. This is something that so far, I think, in the last 1 year, maybe 2 years, growth has slowed down. But from a long-term perspective, I don't think you see either a late converger stall or a middle-income trap as yet. But I do think that the whole premature deindustrialization and human capital thing should remain a source of anxiety for Sri Lanka, because I think that's what's going to determine, or it's going to be an important factor determining the transition from, say, $11,000 per capita GDP to something like $20,000, $25,000 over the next 10, 15 years. So I think that's going to be something that policymakers should devote a lot of attention to. Now we come to the macroeconomic challenges, what I spoke about, the stresses, the tax to GDP ratio, and the rising burden of external indebtedness and the reliance on this. Now, I think when, say, the IMF or policymakers look at these macroeconomic challenges, they will tell you, as the IMF, I was reading the latest Article 4 report, they say, okay, you have high inflation, do inflation targeting, flexible inflation targeting, and institutional change that will improve that. Fiscal rules, because I think Sri Lanka has had continually high fiscal deficits, debt to GDP ratio at least 80%, and always been high. And they would say improve tax collections. So all these are very good policy recommendations. I have no quibble with them, and I think some of these are being contemplated by the central bank as well. I don't know where you stand on the fiscal rules. Perhaps you're going to make progress on that as well. But as someone who's thought about economic development more broadly, I think that these are all proximate responses. These are not, I think, the more fundamental causes of the macroeconomic pathologies that I spoke about, whether it's the low tax collection or the high inflation or the high deficits. I don't know how many of you know that Milton Friedman, all of you know that he said inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But he actually said, but that's just the proximate cause. Because think about it. If you tell a country, I have high inflation because the money supply is too high, the natural question is, what don't they know that high money supply will cause inflation and therefore they should not have high money supply? So there's something deeper that's actually leading to the high money supply, not some ignorance on the part of certainly not such illustrious people as you who manned the central bank over the last 40 years. It's not that people are stupid that they don't know that high money causes inflation. So the question is, the deeper question is that why do you consistently have the inability to rein in high money supply? And that's why some of my own research and other people's research have shown that macroeconomic pathologies have deeper social and institutional origins. And essentially, the big point I would like to highlight here is that essentially, and this is really the Cambridge Marxist view on inflation as well, which I actually am sympathetic to, which is that if you think about macroeconomic stresses, they're really about conflicts about how to share the pie. That's what whether it's low tax collection, high inflation, high deficits, it's really a kind of squabble between different interest groups in society to get a share. So one way I interpret all that I said about the achievements and challenges on Sri Lanka is to say that, look, you've done a very good job on actually increasing the size of the pie over the last 40, 50 years. But I think you've had ongoing stresses on how to share this pie between different groups. I mean, your social conflict is a manifestation of that to some extent. Of course, identity and religion are way above my pay grade. I know nothing about these things. I don't want to talk about them. Because if you talk about them, you're almost certainly likely to get into trouble. But so I don't want to talk about them. But then I think that the intuition or the insight that all these macro pathologies have to do with deeper social origins is very, very important. Now, if you think about the declining tax collections, and I will draw an analogy with India, is that when you think about declining tax collections, again, the proximate thing will be to say, get rid of exemptions, raise taxes, etc., etc. But again, are governments so stupid that they don't know that, this is what? They're unable to do that for some deeper reason. And I think in the case of declining tax collections, it almost surely is a signal that some parts of the social contract are breaking down, which is reflected in the fact that people think that they don't want to voluntarily contribute to the national effort in some sense. So think of it this way. You raise taxes through sticks, but taxes also go up over time because people feel they want to, pay taxes because they get all these services, whether it's law and order, whether it's public goods, whether it's redistribution. So something has happened, and this has been happening in Sri Lanka since 1990. So my sense is that the social contract in Sri Lanka has frayed in ways that I mean, we all think about the social contract in terms of the conflict in Sri Lankan society, but I think, to me, these are manifestations, economic manifestations of the fraying of the social contract in Sri Lanka as well. So my totally useless prescription for Sri Lanka is, I think, rebuilding the social contract, I think, is going to be at the heart of your macroeconomic pathologies, addressing them as well. Last slide, I've bored you enough, but I have one new thought with which I want to stir up the pot a little bit. So I think that, and I think Sri Lanka is going to be unique in this respect. Let me tell you what this. So when you think about two striking facts, tax collections coming down, reliance on external resources going up. Prima facie, this seems like, Raghu and I wrote a series of papers, and Utsav helped us on one of that. Series of papers on, the problems with foreign aid. We said, foreign aid did not contribute to long-run growth. It actually undermines domestic institutions because accountability mechanisms go away. And foreign aid also leads to uncompetitive exchange rates because all this money comes in. Trade on non-tradables, prices go up, wages go up, and export sectors. So we have a series of papers, Rajan and Subramanian, where we talk about, the pathologies associated with foreign aid. At first blush, when I saw these things, I said, wow, Sri Lanka is another case of the Rajan Subramanian thing. It turns out, no. Sri Lankan thing is very unique. I call this a quasi-aid pathology. I don't fully understand it, but let me tell you why it's distinctive from the traditional aid curse. So if you look at, in the aid curse, normally what happens is tax collections decline because you get all these external resources. So you get aid, you say, oh, I'm getting my resources elsewhere, I don't need to tax my citizens. And that happens a lot of the time. But here, that doesn't fit the facts because the tax decline precedes the reliance on external resources. So it's not aid coming in and undermining domestic accountability, and so Sri Lanka is different in that respect. The other way to think about this correlation is to say that actually tax receipts came down, and because of that you relied, so the reverse causation, as it were. But that too does not seem to fill the facts, because it doesn't seem to be the case that tax declines are necessarily associated with higher deficits and which need to be plugged in via external resources. This seems to be something that's quite different. I mean, it seems to me that these are two independent things happening at the same time, or at least not totally independent, but certainly not linked via the natural foreign aid curse. By the way, it's quasi-aid because in this case it's not aid, it's non-concessional stuff. So that's why I call it a quasi-aid. One should maybe call it a kind of a quasi-debt pathology. So it's not, it seemed to be two independent processes going on here, where tax collections declining are part of this deeper fraying of the social contract that you see in other pathologies like inflation, high deficits, etc., and people unwilling to pay taxes, as it were. So that's thing. And then the external resource reliance, seems to have happened for some other independent reason, not necessarily related to plugging domestic resource gaps. Because after all, I think your savings and investment things are reasonably good. So it's not as if there are massive, and it's not that current account deficits have ballooned and that's why you've had to. It's something different going on. So in terms of your challenges, macro challenges, there's the kind of social contract dimension, I think, that needs to be addressed. And there is this whole question about the external financing, the terms, and what it's doing to long-run external sustainability are, I think, two distinct things that I think that Sri Lanka will have to address. My own view is that I have some views on the external financing. Is there a role for international cooperation for dealing with this problem of external financing that might not be going forward confined to Sri Lanka alone? But if I tell you what my idea is, I'll probably be fired even before my date of departure from India. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to write about it the day after I leave my current job. So please watch out for that. But I think there might be a role for international cooperation. So let me conclude by saying, I think, personally it's been, and it's only whetted my appetite to learn more about Sri Lanka. I read a lot of Sri Lankan fiction, but I think I should read a lot of Sri Lankan economics as well. And of course, if I may invite myself, Governor, 1 or 2 years from now, if I could come and spend courtesy of the seigniorage of the Bank of Sri Lanka to come and spend some time further researching Sri Lanka. But I think my bottom line is that terrific achievements, or very good in terms of social indicators, in terms of expanding the economic pie, but something is awry on sharing that social pie because of the social contract. Now I see the macro pathologies as kind of stemming from those deeper things. And then you have this new issue about the external financing. I think it's something that we need to look into. But if you can address these two, that's more easily said than done. I have no doubts that 10, 15 years from now, all this late Converger stall and middle income trap will seem completely nonsensical from a Sri Lankan point of view. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be here.